Welcome, seekers of stories and keepers of memory, to Faces of History, the place where we step into the shadows of the past and stand beside those whose suffering, courage, and stubborn survival remind us how fragile and fierce the human story can be. I am your host, the Duke of New York, your guide through deserts of silence, archive, and the soft echoes of voices long unheard. Tonight, we walk through a landscape of dust, hunger, and heartbreak. Ethiopia from 1983 to 1985, a time when drought, politics, and the cruel neglect of the powerful left millions on the edge of starvation. It is a story not just of numbers, but of faces, of children whose bellies swelled with nothing, of mothers who carried hope in cracked hands, of fathers who buried sons and rose each day to dig for the living. And tonight we remember the famine in Ethiopia, a famine that took more than 1 million lives, displaced millions more, and burned images into the world's conscience that still flicker in our collective memory. To grasp the famine that devoured Ethiopia from 1983 to 1985, you must first see the land through the eyes of those who lived and died on it. Ethiopia is a land of staggering contrasts. Lush highlands rolling into dry lowlands, river valleys hidden between rugged mountains, ancient churches carved from stone standing beside fields that crack open under an unforgiving sun. It is one of the oldest nations on earth, the cradle of ancient empires, a realm where emperors once claimed descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a land that fiercely defended its independence while empires rose and fell around it. Yet, for millions of Ethiopians in the 20th century, daily life was not about kings or crowns, but about soil, rain, and survival. In the 1980s, over 80% of Ethiopians lived as subsistence farmers. Families like the Mengistu family in Tigray or the Desta family in Wallo, they woke to the crow of roosters before dawn, pushed wooden plows behind oxen, scattered seeds into rows dug by hand, and prayed the rains would come on time. They lived in tukuls, round huts made of wattle and daub, thatched with grass. Their children, barefoot and lean, learned to herd goats before they learned to read. Many never did learn to read, but they could read the signs of rain in the clouds, the moods of the river, the tremble of cattle that foretold sickness. Their world turned on fragile cycles, the short rains and the long rains. When they came, green shoots blanketed the highlands, and the hills smelled of damp earth and wildflowers. When they failed, famine stalked the land like a hyena in the dark. But hunger was not new here. Drought was part of Ethiopia's long memory, older than the empires that once rose and crumbled on this soil. What changed was the world wrapped around that ancient rhythm. Governments that shifted borders on maps, leaders who ruled from distant palaces, militias who fought wars in mountain passes and river valleys, using the people as fuel for their ambitions. In the north, in Tigray and Wallo, life was especially harsh. This was the heartland of past famines, the same provinces where famine struck in 1958 and again in 1973, when Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown after the world glimpsed the horror of dying peasants hidden behind courtly silence. For a boy like Abebe, let us name him so we do not lose him to statistics, childhood was an apprenticeship in endurance. He learned to carry water from distant springs, to watch his mother grind teff into flour by hand, to join his father on fields so dry that seeds seemed to vanish into the dust. In good years, the harvest brought relief. Injera bread, milk from skinny cows, maybe a cup of honeyed coffee for elders beneath an acacia tree. In lean years, families rationed handfuls of grain, stretching one meal into two, then into none. And yet, through it all, these families were bound by something stronger than soil alone: community. The elders gathered in smoky huts to decide when to plant and when to harvest. Neighbors helped one another build fences, dig wells, care for the sick. A funeral, a wedding, a birth, these were not private events, but threads in a vast, frayed tapestry of kinship and shared fate. They were farmers, yes, but also singers and storytellers, priests and midwives, weavers of cloth, bearers of ancient faith. Ethiopia is a land where Christianity took root before Europe's cathedrals rose, where Islam and animist traditions braided themselves into village life like roots beneath the ground. But no community, no matter how tight its bonds, can hold back the sky when it withholds rain. When the cycle broke in 1983, Families like Abebe's first hoped it would pass. The oxen grew thinner. The children's hair lost its shine. Bellies swelled with invisible hunger, while the men watched clouds that never opened. They prayed, in churches perched on mountain cliffs, in secret groves older than the oldest scrolls. They asked the saints, the angels, the old spirits to bring rain. But what they did not know, what they could not see, was that this drought would be made deadlier, not by the sun alone, but by men in uniforms and suits who chose silence over salvation. And so, beneath that vast African sky, millions waited. A child held his father's hand while the soil turned to powder. A mother rocked her baby to sleep beside an empty basket. A grandfather gathered what seeds he could, knowing they might never sprout. This was the land, ancient, proud, betrayed by clouds and kings alike. This was the people, fragile as stalks of teff, stubborn as the rocky hills, and about to face the hunger that would drag their faces before the eyes of the world. Tonight, we stand beside them at the edge of this dry field, and we keep listening. Because their story did not end in dust. It carried across oceans into living rooms, into songs and charity concerts, into debates about power, aid, and human dignity. But first, before the world would care to look, the famine had to come into the open, impossible to deny, unstoppable to the people left waiting for rain that never came. Drought and the Duke of New York, the rains faltered. In Ethiopia, this phrase is no poetic metaphor. It is a quiet, slow dagger drawn across the neck of the land. The farmers felt it first. They always do. A week of dry skies where there should be showers, rivers that ran thin, wells that needed to be dug deeper, the ropes lowering buckets further into dark silence. When the crops failed, they did not fail all at once. Sorghum fields browned from the edges inward. The cattle ribs showed through their hides. Families sold the chickens, then the goats. Finally, they sold the oxen, their last tool for plowing, a decision made with shaking hands because selling the ox meant there might never be another harvest again. By late 1983, entire villages were caught in a tightening noose. In Tigray and Wollo, the land that had always given and taken turned against its people with dry cruelty. And when the people turned to the new rulers of Ethiopia, the men in uniforms with red stars on their caps, they found not mercy, but silence. The Derg, the brutal Marxist-Leninist junta led by Mengistu Haile Mariam, ruled Ethiopia with slogans of revolution and promises of progress. In the late 1970s, they deposed Emperor Haile Selassie in a tide of blood known as the Red Terror, executing thousands of students, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of disloyalty. They promised land reform, they promised equality, they promised to break the feudal bonds that had chained peasants to aristocrats for centuries. But when the famine crept into the north, the Derg's promises became ash. Why? Because hunger is not just about empty fields, it is about power. And the Derg feared power slipping from their grip more than they feared the deaths of peasants. The worst of the famine struck in regions that were also centers of armed resistance. Tigray, where the People's Liberation Front was waging guerrilla war. Eritrea, which had been fighting for independence since the 1960s. To Mengistu and his generals, a starving village was a potential rebel village, people whose suffering might swell the ranks of insurgents. Acknowledging the famine, opening the north to foreign eyes, inviting journalists, aid workers, and relief convoys, this could mean admitting weakness, and weakness invited more revolt. Official reports minimized crop failures. Regional governors downplayed hunger. When local officials tried to sound the alarm, pleading for grain shipments, trucks, medicine, they found the doors of ministries shut. Aid groups were allowed into some regions, but carefully watched. Trucks were denied passes through conflict zones. Food convoys were rerouted, sometimes blocked altogether. The government staged tours for visiting journalists that avoided the worst-hit areas. A tragic sleight of hand while mothers buried children beneath thorn trees. Meanwhile, life in Addis Ababa, the capital, carried on with the strange normalcy of distance. Party officials gathered for conferences on Marxist doctrine while peasants walked barefoot for days just to reach a place with a few handfuls of grain. Propaganda posters showed tractors plowing lush fields, the bright future of socialism drawn in red and gold, while in the north, children sucked on strips of bark to calm the burning in their bellies. Some officials made the silence worse with cruel calculation. The famine was not just neglected, it was used. Food became a weapon of war. Villages suspected of feeding rebels were starved into submission. Entire populations were uprooted and marched away from their ancestral lands, forced into resettlement camps where disease finished what hunger began. The government's grand villagization policy moved millions into collective farms and planned settlements, an experiment in central control that claimed to offer schools, clinics, new irrigation. In truth, it broke communities, tore families from their burial grounds, and left the weak to die along the way. Still, the Derg's iron grip could not bury the truth forever. Aid workers, some local, some foreign, smuggled out letters and secret reports. Church networks carried whispers of famine beyond Ethiopia's borders. Journalists who slipped through government censors found skeletal camps hidden in the northern highlands. By 1984, the horror could not be hidden any longer. Entire districts were ghost lands. Elders who could remember the famines of 1958 and 1973 said this was worse. They could see it in the children's eyes, that faraway stare, the body shrinking in on itself, the silence that replaces crying when the body has no more to give. When the BBC's Michael Buerk stepped into Coram in October 1984 and filmed the world's first clear look at this horror, he described it as the closest thing to hell on earth. In the footage, mothers pressed dying infants to their dry breasts, flies crawled on sunken cheeks, lines of the starving stretched across the dust like shadows. It was the image the Derg had tried to keep hidden, and now the world could not look away. But for those in the villages, the camera did not mean rescue overnight. Hunger is a patient predator. It takes its time, long after headlines fade. While the world gasped, relief agencies scrambled. But convoys needed safe passage through conflict zones. Governments haggled over who would deliver aid, where, and when. Each delay was measured in wasted bodies, and in the north, fathers still buried their sons. Mothers still walked barefoot for miles with a child wrapped in rags, hoping there might be a sack of grain at the end of the road. This was drought and denial. A deadly duet that made a dry season into a graveyard of a million souls. Next, we'll follow how the silence finally broke open, how music, television screens, and the roar of global compassion forced the world to see what power tried to hide. There are moments in history when the weight of silence collapses under the force of a single image. In October 1984, one such image came flickering across televisions from Coram, Ethiopia. A skeletal child, eyes wide and empty, a fly crawling across cracked lips that did not move to brush it away. BBC reporter Michael Buerk's broadcast cut through the polite chatter of comfortable living rooms. He called it a biblical famine in the 20th century. For millions watching in Britain, Europe, and America, the story of Ethiopia's drought and the Derg's denials was no longer hidden behind iron-fisted censors and remote geography. It was right there in color over dinner plates piled with food. The world gasped. Then the world asked, what can we do? Churches took up collections. Relief agencies scrambled to charter cargo planes, trucks, medical teams. In Britain, a generation of musicians turned that question into a weapon of melody and mass conscience. Bob Geldof, an Irish singer from the Boomtown Rats, sat transfixed by the images on his screen. Outraged by the complacency, he phoned fellow musician Midge Ure with a simple mission. We must do something, and we must do it now. From that phone call came Band Aid, a spontaneous coalition of Britain and Ireland's biggest pop stars. They gathered in a small London studio in November 1984. On that cold day, voices that usually sold stadiums worth of tickets united behind one question sung to the world. Do they know it's Christmas? It was an imperfect song. Some found the lyrics patronizing, some cringed at Western pity wrapped in holiday cheer, but the impact was undeniable. The single sold over 1 million copies in days, topping charts, flooding relief agencies with donations. The famine, once buried in dusty fields, now haunted the top of the pop charts. In the United States, the echo grew louder. Inspired by Band Aid, American artists came together under the banner of USA for Africa. On a January night in 1985, some of the biggest voices in pop, Michael Jackson, Lionel Richie, Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, Bruce Springsteen gathered in a Los Angeles studio. The result was We Are the World. It played across every radio station. It won Grammys, but more importantly, it raised over $60 million for famine relief. A tidal wave of coins and compassion that helped charter more planes, send more trucks, deliver more grain. Then, in July 1985, came Live Aid, the grand spectacle of rock and charity, broadcast to 1.5 billion people across 150 countries. Wembley Stadium in London and JFK Stadium in Philadelphia pulsed with music and moral outrage for 16 hours straight. Queen, U2, David Bowie, Led Zeppelin, Madonna, legends on stage, while images of famine victims played on giant screens. Viewers reached into pockets, wrote checks, pledged donations that poured in by the second. By the end of that day, another $127 million had been raised for Ethiopia's starving millions. For the first time, famine in Africa was not a footnote in diplomatic cables. It was headline news, charity singles, classroom bake sales. Children who could not find Ethiopia on a map now dropped coins into jars with that name written in block letters. Yet for all the good that music did, the reality on the ground was more complicated and far more tragic than a song could fix. Planes full of grain arrived at airports that lacked roads to deliver it to the hinterlands. Aid was caught in the crossfire of Ethiopia's brutal civil conflicts. Trucks were blocked by militias demanding bribes. Some aid was misused by the Derg, who forced starving families to resettle in government-controlled areas far from rebel strongholds. Thousands died in these forced marches and camps, ghosts lost behind statistics that donors would never see. Still, the outpouring mattered. In remote villages, the distant thunder of Western pop stars translated into sacks of grain handed to mothers who had not tasted bread in months. Medical teams treated emaciated children. Vaccines stemmed epidemics in filthy camps where the dead once outnumbered the living. Some families found hope on these rough trails of compassion. Some children survived because a stranger on the other side of the world could not look away. But the question lingers in the quiet between verses. Why did it take a song to wake the world? Why did it take flies on children's faces, a broadcast at dinner time, to break through the indifference of politicians and the blind spots of distant governments? And deeper still, why does famine, ancient as drought itself, still come wearing the same mask? Drought sharpened by denial, hunger made monstrous by neglect. The songs faded from the charts. New crises rose to fill the headlines. But in Ethiopia's highlands, the living bore the scars of bellies that swelled from starvation, of villages uprooted, of neighbors lost. They carried the story forward long after the microphones were packed away. Tonight, their whispers remind us, the world did wake up, but it nearly woke too late. And some, no matter the charity concerts, never woke again. When we speak of famine, we often speak of the dead, the toll, the count, the nameless millions who vanish into mass graves or shallow pits by dry riverbeds. But famine does not end with the dying. It echoes in the ones who live. In Ethiopia, when the rains finally returned in parts of the highlands, they found a people changed. The survivors, the children with bellies once bloated with hunger, the mothers with sunken eyes who had buried more than they dared to name, these were the living testimony that famine is not only an event, but a wound that never fully closes. Let us say that one day, after weeks of waiting in a makeshift feeding camp near Korum, a lorry rattled up, dusty and battered, bringing sacks of grain and powdered milk stamped with foreign flags. The men who unloaded it did not speak his language. They handed out bowls of thin porridge. A nurse checked his sunken arms for infection, treated the sores on his skin. He did not understand their words, but he understood the food. His mother wept as he swallowed his first solid mouthful in weeks. Abebe survived, but survival is not the end of famine. It is the beginning of its memory. The survivors carried on, back to fields abandoned for months, back to villages where entire families were missing. They found their cattle gone, their homes sometimes occupied by soldiers or rebels or new settlers. They dug in dry soil again, hoping the rains would stay true. For many, there was no going back at all. Under the Derg's harsh resettlement program, more than 500,000 people were moved, some willingly, many by force. Government trucks arrived in famine camps and loaded families onto them like grain sacks. They were promised new land in the south and west, greener, more fertile. But for thousands, the promise turned to nightmare. Crammed into open trucks for days, people died on the road. Families were separated. The sick and weak fell behind and vanished in the dust. Camps meant to house them were unprepared. No clean water, no clinics, no food stores waiting. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion finished what starvation had begun. Yet even so, life clung stubbornly to the survivors. Villages were reborn with new thatched huts beside the ruins of the old. Small hands planted teff seeds in fields that had once buried brothers and sisters. Churches rang their cracked bells. Babies were born to mothers who once thought they could bear no more grief. Survivors carried famine in their bones, their stories etched deep in their memories. Children grew into adults who remembered the taste of roots boiled to poison. Mothers passed on stories to sons and daughters. Do not trust the sky to feed you. Do not trust governments to protect you. Trust only the land, your neighbors, and the quiet strength inside you. Some survivors carried their scars far beyond Ethiopia's borders. Thousands fled, first to Sudan, then further still. Some found new homes in Canada, the United States, Australia. They carried with them faded photographs of those left behind and memories of a land that still burned in their dreams. These immigrants, scattered in small Ethiopian communities across foreign cities, told their children, "You do not know the taste of true hunger, and may you never know it." They sent money home, built churches in new languages, kept the memory alive so that the lost would not be completely lost. In Ethiopia itself, the political tides shifted. By 1991, the Derg was overthrown. Mengistu fled into exile, still alive today, hiding in Zimbabwe, untouched by the reckoning that history owes him. A new government took power, promising democracy and reconstruction. Aid agencies poured in with new plans, irrigation projects, new roads to reach remote farms, new drought monitoring systems. For a while, it seemed the old cycle might be broken. Better warning systems meant food relief arrived sooner. New crops, new seeds, new policies tried to ensure that when the sky failed, people did not have to fail with it. Yet even now, famine whispers in Ethiopia's dry corners. Climate change sharpens the blade. Armed conflict flickers like old embers refusing to die. The survivors watch each failed rain season with the memory of the 1980s lodged in their hearts like a buried thorn. For those who survived, the famine never truly ended. It lives in stories told around hearth fires, in the soft prayers at dawn for steady rain, in the careful rationing of grain in good years. For they know better than anyone how quickly enough can turn to nothing. And so, when you see an image of a famine and the camera shows you a skeletal child or a mother's eyes wide with silent pleading, remember that there are always survivors, and the survivors remember everything. Famine is more than empty stomachs. It is a silence that echoes across generations, a silence made of names never spoken again, of fields where laughter never returned, of the quiet guilt of those who survived when others did not. The famine in Ethiopia from 1983 to 1985 left more than 1 million dead, but it also left tens of millions living with the shadows of that loss. The fathers who could not feed their children, the mothers who wrapped tiny bodies in scraps of cloth and dug graves with their bare hands, the children who learned too young that sometimes the sky does not listen when you pray for rain, and neither do the powerful men who rule over you. And what of those men, the architects of silence? Mengistu Haile Mariam, who ruled behind barbed wire and slogans, fled his country when his grip slipped. He lives still, old now, protected in exile. He never stood in a court to answer for the lives that hunger claimed while he turned the famine into a weapon of war. His regime's fall did not erase the scars it left behind. Ethiopia has changed, yet the same old threats remain. Drought still comes, sometimes faster now as the climate shifts and the world warms. Conflict still flickers, sometimes reigniting where the land is dry and the people are desperate. But to remember only the cruelty is to miss the truth of survival. The people of Ethiopia are not a tragedy frozen in time. They are resilience written into the soil. They rebuilt their villages. They reseeded their fields. They taught their children the hard lessons. Work the land with care. Trust your neighbors when the government turns its back. Listen for the clouds, but trust your own hands more. Those who fled built new lives in faraway cities. They sent money home to feed families, build wells, fund schools, and they taught new generations to carry the old names, old songs, old stories, so that famine would not steal even memory. There is another echo that lingers, the sound of millions who refuse to look away. The farmers in Tigray and Wollo never met the rock stars of Wembley Stadium. They did not hear the songs on MTV or hold the cassettes in their hands, but the songs mattered. The charity concerts, the donations, the truckloads of grain, imperfect as they were, proved that a world can wake up when confronted with the raw face of hunger. It was not enough to save everyone, but it saved many. And it showed the power of ordinary people to stand against the indifference of power when they choose not to look away. Tonight, as you turn off this story and go back to your warm house, your stocked fridge, your full plate, remember, famine is never just an act of nature. It is drought sharpened by politics, neglect, and greed. It is what happens when silence and selfishness are allowed to bloom where rain does not. If there is a lesson that echoes from Ethiopia's dry fields to us today, it is this: we are never powerless unless we choose to be. If we look away, the silence grows. If we listen, truly listen, perhaps next time, fewer graves will be dug in dusty soil. Thank you for standing with me in the shadows tonight, for keeping company with the ghosts and the survivors alike. May their stories remind us that history is not just behind us. It walks beside us, waiting for us to choose what comes next. I am the Duke of New York, and this was Faces of History. Until next time, listen for the stories buried under the noise. They are still here, they still speak, and they need you to hear them. Good night.